Section. Introduction. In this paper, we explore the concept of function references, a powerful tool in programming that allows a program to carry references to its own functions. This tool can be used in various settings, enabling complex control flow through deferred invocations and flexible mappings from inputs to a target task. We present evidence that autoregressive transformers, when trained on large amounts of natural text, develop a basic form of function references. We start by examining in-context learning, ICL, a mechanism that has been studied from different perspectives, including making copies and from a theoretical viewpoint. However, the computations done by large models to generalize and execute complex ICL functions are not yet fully understood. We introduce the concept of function vectors, FVs, which are compact vector representations of input-output tasks found within the transformer hidden states during ICL. An FV doesn't directly perform a task, but triggers the execution of a specific procedure by the language model. Function vectors come into play when we apply causal mediation analysis to identify the flow of information during ICL. We describe a method called activation patching to identify a few attention heads that mediate many ICL tasks. These heads work together to transport a function vector that describes the task. The function vector can be formed by summing the outputs of the causal attention heads. We hypothesize that function vectors are a general mechanism that spans many types of functions. To test this, we create a dataset of over 40 diverse ICL tasks of varying complexity. We calculate function vectors for these tasks and investigate their impact in triggering those functions across a variety of language models, ranging from 6 billion to 70 billion parameters. We also explore whether function vectors are portable, meaning whether they can be applied in diverse settings or are limited to contexts very similar to those where they were extracted. We compare the effects of function vectors when inserted into diverse input contexts, including differently formatted forms, zero-shot formats, and natural text contexts. We find that function vectors are remarkably robust, typically triggering function execution even in contexts that bear no resemblance to the original ICL context. We also question whether the action of function vectors can be explained by word embedding vector arithmetic. We examine decodings of function vectors and find that although function vectors often encode a function's output vocabulary, those vocabularies do not fully identify a function vector. In other words, to invoke functions, function vectors require some information beyond what is encoded in the top vocabulary words. Lastly, we investigate whether the space of function vectors has its own vector algebra over functions rather than words. We construct a set of composable ICL tasks and test the ability of function vectors to obey vector algebra compositions. Our findings reveal that, to some extent, vector compositions of function vectors produce new function vectors that can execute complex tasks that combine constituent tasks. We emphasize that function vector algebra is distinct from semantic vector algebra over word embeddings. We also present a motivating observation. When a transformer processes an ICL prompt with exemplars demonstrating a task, do any hidden states encode the task itself? We find that adding the average activations at particular layers induces the model to perform the task in the new context. For example, if the task is to find the antonym, adding the average activations at layer 12 in GPTJ causes the model to produce antonyms in a zero-shot context, with 24.3% accuracy. This suggests that the average activations at layer 12 do encode the antonym task. In conclusion, our research provides new insights into the role of function vectors in context learning and their potential applications in various tasks. Our datasets, code, and evaluation scripts are available for further research and exploration. Section Summary. In this paper, the authors investigate the presence and role of function references in autoregressive transformers trained on natural text. They find that these models develop function vectors, FVs, which are compact representations of input-output tasks found within the transformer hidden states. FVs can trigger the execution of specific procedures by the language model, and they are remarkably robust, even in diverse contexts. Additionally, the authors explore the vector algebra of FVs and find that composed FV vectors can execute complex tasks that combine constituent tasks. Section. Causal mediation to extract function vectors from attention heads. We're going to simplify and explain a method called causal mediation, which is used to extract function vectors from attention heads. This method is used to understand how information flows during a process called ICL, or instructed codex learning. Let's imagine we have a transformer model, which we'll call F, and an ICL prompt, which we'll call P. This prompt comes from a dataset that represents a specific task, T. We give the model pairs of inputs and outputs, denoted as X_I, Y_I. The model then has to figure out the relationship between these pairs to predict the answer to a new query, X_IQ. Our goal is to find the parts of the model that play a crucial role in predicting the answer, Y_IQ. We focus on the attention heads, which are the parts of the transformer models that move information between different positions in the data. For each attention head, denoted as A_LJ, and task dataset, P_T, we calculate the average of task conditioned activations, denoted as bar A_T_LJ. We then run the model on an uninformative ICL prompt, P_I_T, where each input, X, is paired with a random output. Now, the model is less likely to generate the correct output, Y_Q, because it can't infer the relationship from incorrect ICL examples. While running the model on this uninformative prompt, we replace an attention head activation with the average task conditioned activation and measure its causal and direct effect towards recovering the correct answer. The idea here is to measure how much using the correct average attention head output increases the likelihood of the target response, Y_IQ, compared to the likelihood of this token under the uninformative prompt. A larger value means that the corresponding head is more influential in promoting the correct response. We then calculate each attention head's average and direct effect by averaging this difference across all tasks and prompts. To find the attention heads with the strongest causal effects, we repeat this process for each attention head in the model, for all layers, and all head indices. We then collect the attention heads with the highest average and direct effect over all layers. These are the attention heads that are primarily responsible for transporting information about the demonstrated ICL task. We can represent the contribution of these attention heads as a single vector by taking the sum of their average outputs over a task, which we call a function vector for task T. We can then test the causal effect of a function vector by adding it to hidden states at any layer as the model resolves a prompt and measuring its performance in executing the task. We use a series of language models to carry out this process, and we tested on over 40 relatively simple tasks to see if function vectors can be extracted in diverse settings. Some of these tasks include generating the antonym of a word, capitalizing a word, translating an English word to French, and changing a verb from present to past tense. Section Summary. In this section, the authors apply causal mediation analysis to identify the components of a transformer model that play a causal role in predicting the correct answer for a given task. They focus on the attention heads and measure their causal and direct effect, C, in recovering the correct answer. By identifying the attention heads with the strongest causal effects, they create a set called A, and represent their contribution as a function vector, FV, for each task. These FVs can be added to hidden states at any layer of the model to improve task performance. Section. Portability of function vectors. In this section, we delve into the adaptability of function vectors, which refers to how well adding a function vector to a specific layer at the final token position of the prompt can make the language model perform a task in different contexts from the ones it was originally extracted from. To make our analysis simpler, we only consider test queries that the language model answers correctly when given a 10-shot ICL prompt. We report all accuracies and standard deviations over 5 random seeds on this filtered subset. The results are similar even when incorrect ICL are included. More details in the appendix. We evaluated function vectors at different layers and reported the results, averaged across 6 tasks, for adding function vectors to shuffled label ICL prompts and zero-shot contexts across 3 models, GPT-J, GPT-Neox, and Llama 2, 70B, at layers 9, 15, and 26 respectively, approximately 1/3 of the total layers. For GPT-J, we also compared the effectiveness of function vectors to other methods for extracting task-inducing vectors, including simple state averaging. Our first observation is that the base model struggles to perform the tasks in the uninformative shuffled label ICL and zero-shot settings. However, adding the function vector significantly improves the model's task performance in both cases. Our second observation is that our proposed method for constructing function vectors via causal mediation performs better than the layer averaging approach in both contexts. We also examined the results across layers for the zero-shot case. The sharp decrease of causal effects in later layers suggests that function vectors do not simply act linearly, but they trigger late-layer nonlinear computations. This pattern of causality is seen across a variety of tasks, autoregressive model architectures, and model sizes. Even when performance is low, as in English-French with GPT-NEOX and Llama 2, 70B, adding the function vector in middle layers still results in large relative improvements to accuracy over the zero-shot baseline. The results are consistent across model sizes. We also checked whether the function vector is dependent on the ICL template that it is extracted from. We tested the function vector on 20 additional ICL templates and in natural text settings, adding the function vector at layer 9 for GPT-J, approximately 1/3 of the total layers. We created 20 different ICL templates that vary the form of the ICL prompt across prefixes and delimiters of input-output pairs. We evaluated function vectors on GPT-J for these 20 templates in both shuffled label and zero-shot template settings. Across our 6 tasks, adding the function vector executes the task with an average accuracy of 76.2% in shuffled label setting and 40.0% in the zero-shot setting, while GPT-J only scores 32.3% and 6.2% on the same settings, respectively. Despite higher variance, this performance is similar to performance in the same settings with the original template. We also evaluated function vectors on natural text completions. Given a natural text template, we insert a test query word and have the model generate a certain number of tokens. We add the function vector to the final token of the original prompt, and for all subsequent token predictions to guide its generation. We search the generated string with a simple regex parse to compute whether the generation includes the correct target for the inserted query word. The results show that the antonym is in the function vector completion significantly more than the original completion. In fact, we find that the efficacy of the antonym function vector in eliciting the correct response in these natural text templates performs on par with the results previously reported for the zero-shot setting. This is true for all 6 tasks, suggesting that the task representation transported during ICL is similar to one that is used during autoregressive prediction in natural text settings. Several studies have tried to understand the states and parameters of transformers by viewing them in terms of their decoded vocabulary tokens. Therefore, we ask, can we understand a function vector by decoding it directly to a token probability distribution? The results show a clear pattern. For most tasks, the decoded tokens lie within the task's output space. However, that is not the case for all tasks. Given these meaningful decodings, we then asked whether the token vocabulary is sufficient to recreate a working function vector. That is, we started with the token distribution, and determined whether a function vector can be reconstructed if we know the top words. We performed an optimization to reconstruct a function vector that matches the distribution when decoded. We found that, while it is possible to partially recreate the functionality of a function vector, good performance typically requires more than 100 vocabulary tokens. In other words, knowledge of the top decoded tokens is usually not enough on its own to construct a working function vector. That suggests that the function vector contains some needed information beyond that expressed by its top decoded tokens. Section Summary. In this section, the authors investigate the portability of function vectors, FVs, in language models. They find that adding an FV to a model significantly improves its performance in different contexts, such as shuffled label ICL prompts and zero-shot settings. The FVs trigger late-layer nonlinear computations and are robust to different input forms, showing similar performance across various tasks and model sizes. Additionally, the decoded vocabulary of FVs reveals meaningful tokens related to the respective tasks, but reconstructing a working FV solely based on the top decoded tokens is usually not sufficient. Section. Vector algebra on function vectors. We're going to delve into the concept of vector algebra on function vectors. The table we've discussed earlier might lead you to believe that function vectors can't be understood as simple semantic vector offsets on word embeddings. However, we're going to explore whether function vectors can follow semantic vector algebra in a more abstract functional behavior space. We'll do this by testing the combination of simple functions into more complex ones. We'll start with 3 tasks that can be conceptually broken down: first copy, first capital, and last copy, as shown in the figure. Using in-context learning, ICL, we gather function vectors, FVs, for all three tasks and label them as v_AC, v_BC, and v_AD. We then create a new vector, v_BD*, by simply adding these vectors together. Ideally, v_BD could serve as a new function vector for a new combined task, which we'll call last capital. We carry out several similar task combinations on a variety of tasks. In each case, we merge a task with first copy and last copy to create a combined last asterisk vector. We then test the accuracy of v_BD as a function vector. We compare this to the accuracy of the FV extracted from ICL, as well as the accuracy of the same model performing the task using ICL. Our results for GPTJ are reported in the table, and you can find the results for Llama 2, 13b, in the appendix. We discovered that FVs can be combined to some extent, with algebraic combinations outperforming FVs on some tasks, and even matching ICL on others. However, some tasks, including those where ICL and function vectors perform well, seem to resist the type of vector combination we're attempting. We believe that the success or failure of a combination may depend on the combinability of the underlying computations triggered by a function vector. Therefore, FV combination could be a useful tool for further understanding how language models work. Our work is related to other studies that analyze the role of components during the execution of some ICL tasks, as well as those that examine the behavior of ICL attention heads when there are false demonstrations. We also align with findings that observe the importance of label tokens during ICL, and the presence of individual neurons that correlate with specific task performance. Unlike these analyses, we measure causal mediators across a variety of tasks to find a generic function invocation mechanism that identifies and distinguishes between tasks. We also build upon the analyses of prevalent and context copying behavior that appears related to jumps in performance during training. We isolate FVs using causal mediation analysis methods and examine FVs in vocabulary space using the logit-lens methods. Unlike previous works that examine mechanisms underlying specific capabilities, we focus on locating generic function references within a transformer. Other studies have investigated how tasks can be represented within a model. Some have devised a way of training a codebook that yields a compositional task encoding for large language models, LLMs. Others have developed a soft prompt method for compressing and encoding tasks. Our study of function vectors differs from these previous works. Instead of training a model to create function representations, we ask whether a pre-trained transformer already contains compact function representations that it uses to invoke task execution. In context learning, ICL has been studied intensively from many perspectives since its observation in LLMs. Our work differs from those studies of the externally observable behavior of ICL by instead focusing on mechanisms within transformers. We have investigated the representations of input-output functions in transformer-based large language models. Causal mediation analysis has identified compact vector representations which trigger the model to perform a specific task. We call these function vectors FVs. Our analysis reveals that FVs are highly robust to shifts in prompt formats and that the vectors can be combined to compose tasks. Our experimental results also provide several lines of evidence that distinguish function vectors from semantic vector algebra over word embeddings. Function vectors can represent mappings such as antonyms that cannot be expressed as an offset. They cannot be reconstructed from their top 100 vocabulary alone, and they have strong causal effects at early mid layers but near zero effects at late layers. Together, these findings suggest that large language models contain compact vector representations of abstract functions, and that those vectors are able to trigger the performance of non-trivial tasks. Section Summary. The section explores the concept of function vectors, FVs, in transformer-based language models, LLMs. Through causal mediation analysis, FVs are identified as compact vector representations that trigger specific tasks in the model. The analysis shows that FVs are robust to prompt format shifts, can be composed to perform tasks, and differ from semantic vector algebra over word embeddings. These findings suggest that LLMs possess compact vector representations of abstract functions that enable the performance of complex tasks. Section: Ethics. In our research, we aim to shed light on how large-scale language models operate and function. Our goal is to make these complex models more transparent, easier to scrutinize, and more controllable. However, we must also express a word of caution. While our work is intended to be beneficial, there's a risk that it could be misused. For instance, individuals with malicious intent could manipulate these models, introducing or enhancing functions that lead to harmful outcomes.